Without the MBTA, we are not Boston, we are not Massachusetts. There is no alternative other than making sure that we can adequately fund the T and do so that's not on the backs of our riders. We've been working to rebuild the trust after, some difficult years. I think shoring up the T's operations for this year had to be the top priority. Certainly would be advocating for a final package that makes sure that the T has the money and the resources it needs to maintain operations without impacting any of our riders.
Welcome back to Spilling the Tea, the podcast where we take you behind the scenes of the MBTA, breaking down the latest challenges, improvements, and what's next for public transit in Massachusetts. I'm Andrew Cassidy of the MBTA's Customer and Employee Experience Department, and today we're joined by Senator Brendan Crighton, Senate Chair for the Joint Committee on Transportation. Senator Crighton has been deeply involved in discussions around transportation policy, transit funding, and infrastructure improvements in Massachusetts. We're looking forward to hearing his perspective on the future of transit in the Commonwealth. Senator Crighton, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. Appreciate it.
So before we dive into the policy piece, can you tell us about your journey into public service and what led you to have so much of a focus on transportation?
So I got my start in public service right out of college. I was a government major and had done some internships and had gotten familiar with it, knew I wanted to be in public service, didn't know quite where that would lead. And thankfully, my first job was with then Senator Tom McGee, now current T Board Chair. And he definitely, from day one, really, his focus has been transportation. Long before he was the Senate Chair of Transportation, bringing rapid transit to our community, but also looking at the entire system and really recognizing that public transportation isn't just a transportation issue. It's a housing issue. It's an environmental issue, economic issue. And I think I learned a ton working with him.
And so aside from just being a senator, not just being a senator, but aside from being a senator, you were also the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee of Transportation. What does that role entail, and what are your top priorities for improving public transportation in Massachusetts?
So I think the primary role is to review the few hundred bills that come before our committee every year that focus on policy. As part of that, we have public hearings and certainly meet with a wide range of stakeholders to carefully deliberate each bill, decide whether or not how it advances, how it changes in the legislative process. I think also a big part of it inevitably comes down to funding. So it's both, on the operational side, but certainly the capital side. Every year, at least as of now, every year we, take up a Chapter 90 borrowing bill. So that's money for, your roads, sidewalks, and bridges. But we also pretty regularly take up transportation bond bills, which, it's borrowing authorization for the administration, but has a major impact on projects that we're pursuing at the state level. But also when you look at some of the grants we've been able to chase down, some of the big ticket items when you think of Cape Cod bridges or the Alston Turnpike, but also when you think of a lot of things that have to do with rail, which are very expensive. Those are, the direct things related to my work as chair there, but I think also, kind of representing the Senate and also representing my community too, when we look at a longer term vision in how we're going to modernize both our transportation system, but also modernize the way in which we fund that. So a lot of it is getting out and speaking to folks across the Commonwealth, but also, utilizing opportunities like this. So I greatly appreciate you inviting me in.
And does that mean just within your district, or is that you now in this larger transportation chief role? Does that mean that you're talking all around the Commonwealth?
So really all around the Commonwealth. I have my district priorities, which, I think align a lot with other communities' priorities as well, but it's a big state and not everyone, has the benefit of being serviced by the MBTA. So certainly, being focused on regional equity when it comes to transportation. And, that means our regional transit authorities, our RTAs, also West East Rail. And there's a ton of infrastructure problems across the state. I mean, culverts is not something that I talked about a few years ago, but because of, more severe storms due to climate change, that's had a great impact. Speaking of climate change, our emissions reductions, obviously the transportation sector is the biggest emissions producing sector in the Commonwealth, and trying to decarbonize our public fleets, but also incentivize folks on the private side across the Commonwealth. So I try to balance the two. Obviously, I'm elected to serve my district and to make sure we're competing for dollars and resources to make our transportation work. But for any of these bills or policies, it takes a really collaborative approach. I have 39 other senators, different districts, different politics, different philosophies, and trying to build consensus has been my goal.
Since you brought it up, I have to ask you about funding. Obviously, it's always a major topic when it comes to the MBTA and just public transportation on a national level. And I also know there are obviously different parties involved, the governor, of course. What is your role and the legislature, I suppose, as a whole? What is the role there in regards to funding for the MBTA? And what steps are you all taking to ensure more of a sustainable funding model for the MBTA and, again, statewide public transportation?
It's a big issue on the minds of, I think, every legislator, but in particular, those folks that represent communities served by the MBTA. Without the MBTA, we are not Boston. We are not Massachusetts. We are a whole different community place to raise a family and to work. So there is no alternative other than making sure that we can adequately fund the T and do so that's not on the backs of our riders through service cuts or significant fare increases. And I think, we've been working, and I know that the T, certainly under the leadership of the new GM, Phil Lang, as well as the board of directors and everyone here, really working to rebuild the trust after, some difficult years, which followed difficult years due to COVID and other issues. So I think we've made progress in rebuilding that trust, and we can't afford to, move backwards. We have to keep moving forward. I am pleased that Governor Haley has really focused on transportation, obviously with her most recent budget proposal, as well as some additional bills coming our way. I think shoring up the T's operations for this year had to be the top priority. Obviously, the House is going to be taking up the budget first, and then the Senate. So I don't have a crystal ball, but certainly would be advocating for a final package that makes sure that the T has the money and the resources it needs to maintain operations without impacting any of our riders. So that's kind of the immediate. I think in the task force, stabilize, I think, was the first bucket, and making sure that we're preserving these operations. And there are other issues, with roads and other things too, but investments there through using, fair share revenue, which, I think we need to make the case to folks that revenue is, is close to 50-50 with education and transportation. Obviously, education is hugely important as well, but making sure that folks know that the money is being put to good use. And I think shoring up those operations for now is my top priority. The other questions get a little more difficult. I've been kind of in everything on the table, kind of had that approach where there are solutions that have been looked over the last 2 decades. And a lot of this I learned working for Senator McGee. He was the chair back in 2012 or 2013. Really had an opportunity to increase transportation funding, but several pieces unfortunately just fell short. We had indexed the gas tax to inflation, which was overturned at the ballot. There were a few other revenue areas that fell off as well. I think, certainly the senator and others made a great effort to try to transform the system, but it's fallen short. There's been an increased awareness of, the dedicated revenue from the sales tax not meeting expectations and the need to shore this up to make sure that the T is functioning at the highest level and in a more modern transportation infrastructure. So that's a long way of saying, through this budget and through the fair share and the surplus fair share money, make sure that the T is on solid footing for, the coming years, while recognizing that our biggest source of transportation revenue through the gas tax, should be obsolete in the coming years if we're meeting our emissions goals. How do we modernize this and create a more equitable transportation funding system? In my eyes, more user-based in many ways, but also, kind of having diverse streams of funding that are sustainable long-term.
It's no secret that the MBTA had some difficult years in the not so distant past. But obviously last year, after the completion of the track improvement program, the removal of the slow zones, and just kind of that forward momentum, there's definitely a different buzz internally. However, I'm curious, what is the kind of general thought about the MBTA in the State House? Because we're hearing the MBTA come up in conversations that previously it was not a part of. As you mentioned, the governor has made it a very big priority for her. What are the conversations that are being had in relation to the MBTA on the State House?
I definitely agree. There's been kind of a shift, say vibe shift, but it feels like
I'll allow it.
we all want the T to succeed. I feel like there's less just beating up at the T and just, any incident, everyone's just, for a while there, it was almost every day. And some of those, once you start having these bad news stories, they tend to stick around, even if it's, some of these, track incidents were relatively minor, but, it's still an incident and things need to be addressed. And when the FTA came in, it's funny, I became, thank you to the Senate president for appointing me this, but she appointed me and then immediately we had the FTA come in. So I don't know what I did wrong, but trains were on fire and it was, not a great time for the T, but I think we've rebounded. The conversations now are how we can support and how we can deliver on some of these long-term goals. You do still get pushback from folks that aren't part of the system overall. And I think, regional equity needs to be a part of the conversation. We want everyone to have access to public transportation, but I don't think it needs to be a T versus the rest of the Commonwealth conversation. I think we can do both. And I think we do need to recognize that the T has been shortchanged. I think we need to move away from this idea that it's mismanagement. The reform before revenue mantra of the mid 2000s when I started, I think needs to be put aside. Reform is always welcome. And I believe that it's happening on a regular basis here under new management. But at the end of the day, it's dollars. And obviously, the past few months have led to a great deal of uncertainty in almost every aspect of government. But certainly transportation is something that, we're feeling pretty anxious about with this new administration and their misguided policies.
So it's good to hear that there's conversations happening and that they're mostly positive. But obviously, beyond conversations, it's great to see action. And we've seen some. So the state has invested in infrastructure projects like South Coast Rail, which goes online this March, which is fantastic, as well as commuter rail electrification. How do you see these investments actually taking root and really shaping the future of not just transit in Massachusetts, but that kind of additional benefit that transit provides for these communities and, I guess, those who touch it?
I try to remind folks, even if you don't take a train or bus or commuter rail or ferry, that you are impacted every day by our public transportation system for better or worse. And I think when you expand routes like with South Coast Rail, you're giving an opportunity to an entire region of the state that had not had one before to get out of that traffic congestion that drives everyone crazy, keeps you from your family and recreation and disrupts your work life potentially, depending on how bad that traffic is that morning. Gives them an opportunity to have a more reliable and certain trip coming in. Also, it's taking cars off the road, right? So it solves many issues. And I think certainly South Coast Rail is a big deal. I think electrification, while it's still in its infancy, we went from a vote a few years ago on the Fiscal Management Control Board to move forward with phase 1 of electrification, which included the Fairmont line as well as our line, the Environmental Justice Corridor. And to see now that we're actually putting money towards Fairmont, testing that out is promising. And I think when people actually see it working, there's 400 miles of commuter rail. It's going to take a while to electrify it all, but I think certain priority lines you'll see come along much faster. So it's an exciting time in transportation. Obviously, improving technology in the fleet and expansion, all of those things are great, but still keeping an eye on preserving and enhancing our existing system too. So I'm very excited as a proponent of electrification that we're moving past, whether or not we're going to do it into how quickly we can implement it.
Since you brought up the Environmental Justice Corridor, could you just explain exactly what that means for people who aren't familiar with that term and just discuss what the project is as far as electrifying commuter rail and how you see this as benefiting the riders in those communities?
So for a long time, over 100 years at this point, the city of Lynn and really the North Shore had been looking for rapid transit through the extension of the Blue Line from Wonderland and Revere up to Lynn. I can't say exactly why. I've heard many theories as to why that didn't happen. We had certainly political clout for a number of those years or decades in ways that we would have liked to have seen it happen. Actually, one of the first bills I got passed in the Senate, or parts of a bill, was to really take a deep dive and study and get the necessary work done to start to move forward on the Blue Line. And unfortunately, it was shortly thereafter, a few months, that we saw an opportunity along an existing right-of-way on our Newburyport-Rockport line. And knew of the work being done to look into regional rail or electrification, and there's many different pieces to it. and saw what the Fairmont line was looking to do, or really what the people and the electeds from that area were looking to do, and thought we have the same case to be made here. I mean, we're 10 miles outside of Boston. We have this line that, while it goes through communities like Lynn, Revere, Chelsea, and Everett, most of our constituents will never ride on the commuter rail. I never rode the commuter rail, even when I worked in Boston. I'm driving to Blue Line. It's $7 for a one-way trip, plus parking, plus transfer. All that. It's just, for most of my constituents, it's not worth it, or they can't afford it. So the idea with electrification, obviously the environmental benefits, which we call it the environmental justice corridor for a reason, in that many of these communities, so it's land use decisions as well. It's largely industrialized along the line, but you have families and neighborhoods peppered throughout. They're breathing in the diesel exhaust every day from these commuter rail trains. They're dealing with the particulate matter. They're dealing with increased rates of asthma, heart disease, other factors that come to play. And again, they're very unlikely to ever hop on the train. In Lane, I think it's more of an economic reason. The neighborhoods that surround our commuter rail their income levels aren't high enough to afford it. Means tested fares is a game changer, certainly. So like we are pumped about that. We've been pushing for that for quite a long time. There is not a stop in Revere. There is a stop in Chelsea now, or there has been, but an enhanced stop. And then in Everett, there's also not a stop. Going further north at Salem State University, where the vast majority of students are from Lynn, there is no stop at the university. So I think it's increased reliability because of the rolling stock. They're 25% more efficient in terms of reliability. It's the frequency, just because these trains are far lighter than our current locomotives. They can start and stop faster. With that frequency, you're expected to get a greater ridership, which would lead to the ability to have more subway type fares. Also, with that frequency, you're able to have infill stations to create access to points that never had it. Talked about the Blue Line earlier. Having a stop at Wonderland, I mean, it's a couple hundred yards away. You could easily connect both modes there. And I applaud Congresswoman Clark for getting some earmark money there to start to design that. It could be a game changer. And I am talking about this as the senator from that area. So certainly it means a lot to me, but it goes all the way up to Beverly, this concept. And I think it could be replicated along many of the other lines. So, Fairmont's going first. We're hoping to be right behind them, and not to say they have to finish proof of design of concepts. I think certainly, we are working with the T to see what's available out there to help get us on good footing. I think the Draw One Bridge investment, huge. Without that too, at North Station, we're not getting electrification. So we are making investments there. And I do feel sincerely that this is a priority of the governor, priority of the secretary, priority of the GM. So it's an exciting time, but with anything with transportation, you have to be patient and reasonable and just keep moving the ball forward.
I think you're absolutely right. It's definitely one of the most exciting and I think more long-term impacting changes that will happen with the MBTA, the whole electrification piece, because we had Michael Muller on the show a few episodes back, and it's not just switching from diesel to electric, it's shorter headways and, more frequent service. It's the fact that, through battery electric instead of just pure electric, we can start implementing these new coaches, new locomotives rather, well before we would be able to do it otherwise if we had to wait for actual catenary to run along the entirety of our system. So the fact that something so seismic is happening on such a relatively short schedule is absolutely thrilling to see, and can't wait to see it out and about on system. It'll definitely be a new era for the MBTA.
Yeah, I share your enthusiasm completely, and shout out to Mike for all the work he's done. I've been skeptical at times of making the jump to battery electric, and still want to see how it plays out for passenger rail. It's kind of a newer concept, but I think for our riders, anything that gets us there as quickly as we can should be pursued. So I appreciate the work that he and others have done to kind of fast track this. And I think catenary works in certain areas, but where it doesn't work or where we can get there faster with battery electric, it makes absolute sense.
Absolutely. You've not just been a proponent of commuter rail service, but you've also been a proponent of ferry service, specifically with the Lynn Ferry, which opened up not too long ago and will be opening its doors for this year's service at the end of March of this year. Can you tell us a little bit about your role / the story of the Lynn Ferry and I guess your involvement in bringing this to life and why it's so important for the North Shore and surrounding communities?
I steal all of my good ideas from Tom McGee. So when I started with him back in 2005, I didn't know a lot about transportation. Certainly, I'd never thought about ferries. And some of my first impressions were, wow, this guy really likes boats and ferries. Like he talked about it all the time. And, people would roll their eyes and it was not a concept. Like Salem had it, but it was more of a tourist destination. And he led on this kind of in a silo by himself for a while and got buy-in from the city officials. And I got to work on it as a staffer, which was pretty cool to kind of see it be built. And it was through the Seaport Advisory Council at the time. We were able to get money for a terminal through Governor Patrick and at the time Secretary Davey. We got some money for operations. It went well. The ridership isn't nearly what it is now. I think kind of a newer concept at the time. I mean, we're going back, a decade. And, folks just didn't know about it, right? But through that experience, it started to build by the second year. And we were pleased with the ridership. Unfortunately, the next administration that came in was not. And they abruptly, ended ferry service in the city. We even got some federal grants at the time to buy a boat. And that, it became clear that ferries were not a priority. I still get some level of anxiety coming down to this building, the transportation building, because of the amount of meetings I had here on ferries that, it was one roadblock after another. Fast forward to today, I think the governor and secretary deserve a great deal of credit, and the GM, of course, for being willing to put ferries as part of the Sumner Tunnel mitigation. We had asked again and again and again what mitigation is going to be offered our riders when the Sumner Tunnel closes. It's going to completely disrupt the North Shore. We were told there will be no mitigation, which is insane, but we're not going to go down that road. My first call to the governor's office after she was sworn in was to say, we need to pump the brakes on this. We are not ready. We have no mitigation. If my constituents can't get to Boston, they can't get to work, they can't get to healthcare. So thankfully, they came out with a great plan for water transportation, and not just my community, but others, East Boston and Winthrop, and also looked at our commuter rail, cutting the price there and increasing frequency, the Blue Line as well, gave every public transportation option possible out there. And I think we used that opportunity to show that the ferry worked. And when the Summer Tunnel came back, ridership was still, it wasn't what it was, but it was still very strong. And, when you have people being turned away from 150 passenger ferry, it's a big deal. So for anyone that's listening to this on the North Shore, it's free parking. It's right on Blossom Street in Lynn. We are starting the schedule the earliest it's ever been, March 31st. We do believe this can be and will be a year-round ferry service in the future, similar to Hingham and Hull. But for now, we're really excited. We also added weekend service last year, which was so popular. Some people just take the boat ride into Boston and back, but you can go in, have dinner, you can go in and, see, different sites and enjoy the city without ever having to sit in traffic in your car for a reasonable amount. And also, again, on the means tested fares, this is a $7 trip in free parking, but certainly for folks that need it, there are lower fares there as well. It's been tremendously popular for our seniors. So yeah, a huge win. And now my role is basically being a cheerleader, certainly for using transportation funding. When we look at this budget this year, part of it's come from fair share moving forward. I just want to make sure this continuity continues, not just for Lynn. Senator Edwards has been a tremendous ally in this. She's put forward a number of budget amendments, and she's looked at the entire Eastern Coast. So we've partnered with Minority Leader Bruce Tarr, Senator John Keenan from Quincy, Senator Lovely certainly, and kind of all recognizing that water transportation, it's a wonderful amenity to have if you live there, but also gets cars off the road as well. As well as economic development too. Like Senator McGee, my first summer there, took us down to Hingham. We took the ferry from Boston. We go down there, really nothing there. It was a dock and there was like one restaurant, and it was just like, all right, it's like an empty water. Like, I don't want to say it was industrial, like kind of vacant space, some industrial, just it kind of reminded me of how, parts of Lynn's waterfront have been used, just not the best use. We went back there a couple of years later, and this was in the height of the recession too. And you weren't seeing this around the Commonwealth, just buildings going up, residential, mixed use, restaurants lining, like the economic development opportunities are huge. And it was just a transformative. The ferry always had ridership down there, but now you have an entire neighborhood there, certainly tax revenue there for the city. And when you look at, Lynn's waterfront, the potential is just as strong as it is down there. So it's an exciting time for transportation in many ways, but in particular on the water side.
Absolutely. And it's not even just Lynn. For this year, there's been a split from the MBTA where previously the Winthrop Ferry first made a stop all the way down in Quincy to go to Boston. Now that has been split. So now both of those communities have a more direct access to come into the city. There's a dedicated person for the first time ever, Dave Perry, who's heading up the ferry operation. We have more boats coming. It's really a great thing to see that, as a very coastal community here in Boston, in the whole metro Boston area, that we're finally looking for new avenues to, bring a growing Commonwealth to the city using any and all available routes. And to boot, speaking especially of the Lynn Ferry, it's a beautiful ride. It is such a peaceful way to commute. I mean, whenever that starts up and I get the opportunity, it is so much better than being bumper to bumper. I usually do commuter rail, which is also a very seamless process, but being at sea is just something there's something so nice about it. It's a great way to get ready for your workday and a great way to decompress on your way home.
Absolutely. It's very relaxing. No better way to start or end your day. And I will say too, we always call it the Lynn Ferry. It's, really a regional mode of transportation. Yeah. Folks from Marblehead, Swampscott, Nahant. We even have people reverse commuting from Revere to hop on it. So it's definitely something that benefits the entire North Shore. And I don't want to say it's cult-like, but once you ride it, you feel like part of this ferry crew. And there's, certainly different groups on social media that are, some of our biggest cheerleaders and have helped inform us too on what the needs are and what improvements we can make. We have a little task force of legislators that work directly with the T to, say what's working, what's not, how we can improve upon things season to season.
And you mentioned the economic development over in Hingham that you saw. Do you anticipate something similar? Or I guess what other metrics are you looking for success outside of ridership for the Lynn Ferry?
We've seen some, I think, we're not dependent necessarily on the ferry, but certainly now using that as a marketing tool. For the folks that don't know, in Lynn, I think almost every parcel of our waterfront property has been a less than desired use for many years. Obviously going from kind of an industrial way that waterfronts worked, but also just kind of, I guess, not fully appreciating the value of being on the water. I mean, for instance, we have a Walmart on our waterfront, which, again, I shop there from time to time, but it's not the best location for a huge box store. We are now seeing mixed-use residential developments up and down the coast with, good connectivity to that ferry. And I think, I live not far, I can walk to the ferry from my house as well. And I think having a commuter rail there, which we, working towards a new commuter rail stop, new commuter rail garage or some type of mixed-use component there as well. We have really strong bus service in the city of Lynn. So again, not to make this podcast about Lynn, but for the North Shore, I think having a transit hub that provides water transportation, rail, and bus. Actually, we have tremendous cyclist infrastructure. And, for all users, we're really trying to be a hub on the North Shore.
That's great. So we've talked about ferry. We've talked about electrifying the commuter rail. What else is ahead? What does the future of transportation in Massachusetts look like to you? And if you got to pick one major thing to move forward with, what do you think would be the right step, speaking from your role as senator and chair?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is funding. And I think building a consensus, both in the House and the Senate, on what's going to work for every community. I don't think it's, one size fits all approach. I think we need to find what the proper balance is, again, between user-based fees when you think of VMTs or tolling or congestion pricing, and also other mechanisms that have been used elsewhere. So again, I don't know what that balance is yet, but I think, we need to get this budget done, and I'm not going to look too far ahead. That's our goal right now, to make sure we've shored that up for the T and other public transportation. But longer term, this is something we shouldn't have to do every 5-10 years. Like, let's figure this out, modernize it so that we're not reliant on the gas tax, and do it in a way that shows the riders what they're getting out of it too. Like, can't just say we're going to raise tax. We just did through the fair share, right? So we're showing that we're putting that to good use that impacts, our other crisis in housing and many other climate change as well. But how is this going to impact everyone, whether you use public transit or not? That's my goal right now, is working at that. It's a boring answer because it's a work in progress. I would like to see how, it's early on in means tested or low income fares. I would like to see how that's playing out and how many folks are taking advantage of it and making sure that the early numbers seem to suggest that it's working well. But I think being committed to that long term, we need to be very deliberate on that and mindful that, we could see changes in federal money coming our way and that we're in very uncertain times. But having that be a commitment so that every Massachusetts resident, regardless of their income level, has access to public transportation is a big deal for us. So I certainly keep an eye on that. I mean, electrification is a huge one to tackle in itself, but I do think that since I've been there, and this is across all policy matters, the approach back in the day seemed to be more, you do this one big thing. So like one big transportation bond bill, one big housing bill, you name the area, and all right, we're good for 5 years. We're good for 10. We just did that. We tackled that big issue. Now I think there's such a sense of urgency amongst members and certainly the administration that each session, it's not, we did that, let's try something, let's deal with a different subject matter. It's, all right, what was left on the table last time? How can we continue to build progress? We get criticized for omnibus bills from time to time, but, when there are so many really pressing issues of the day, sometimes it makes sense to go big and to try to get as much done as we can in some of these bigger packages. We have the Chapter 90 bill before us, excited to get going with that. Hopefully we'll see some other bigger bills moving forward this session that we can make some of these big investments.
Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise. Appreciate it, Andrew.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of Spilling the Tea. We want to thank Senator Crighton for joining us today and sharing his perspective on transportation policy and public transit in Massachusetts. We also want to thank you, our listeners. We'd love to hear your feedback or ideas for future episodes, so please reach out to us at social@mbta.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. Until then, I'm Andrew Cassidy, and this has been Spilling the Tea.